Hey guys, there was a recent change to Classic WoW, so we were put on an updated client. And recent, it was probably about 3 weeks ago, so middle of September, beginning of September 2024. And there were some API changes that were made that protected a lot of functions that previously were not protected. And one of those functions was the slash click feature or function, whatever you want to call it. So let me. I know my screen. I think it's gonna still. Yeah, it's still gonna put it way over there. Um, so you're not gonna be able to see it because the edges of my screen get scrunched up because of my aspect ratio. But essentially, what's happening without I'm not a developer, but without getting into the details, any macro that you have that clicks another macro, so the slash click functionality of macros, that no longer works in combat. And BCT, which is Buff Cap Tracker, is an add-on that relies. And if you don't know what BCT is, go Google it or go find other videos that talk about it. But it's an add-on that tanks use. Mostly tanks use. I think other classes use it too, but mostly tanks use it to keep themselves under the buff cap of in Classic WoW, so that we don't lose consumables like Stone Shield Potion or Elixir of Mongoose or whatever. And the way that BCT works to strip buffs in combat was to, and I'm on the latest version, and the one of the contributors has put a note in here that so if you pull up BCT and you go to general and you go to blacklist, it sees there's a passive way to remove buffs and then there's an active way. The active way was using slash click BCT, and then it would invoke your blacklist in combat. And the way it would do that is it would basically build these macros in the background, and then whenever you would do that click BCT, it would run through all these macros, and that no longer works in combat. And because it's a protected API function, there doesn't appear. So I've spoken to one of the contributors of this application or of this add-on, and there doesn't appear to be a workaround that we can do. So what that means for tanks and anyone else who wants to remove buffs in combat, and again, I'm sorry you're not gonna be able to see this, but the old school way of doing it, which is cancel auras. So cancel aura bloodthirst, cancel aura blood rage, cancel aura find minerals, cancel aura blessing of salvation. This is the old way that we used to do it before BCT and other weak auras were developed. And it's a pain because there's a lot of stuff that you don't want to have. Like if I go to what profile under most restrictive, so this is my most restrictive profile. If I go to blacklist, I have 43 things that I want to blacklist. Now, macros are limited to 255 characters. And from what I understand, there are add-ons out there that increase this, but the way that they do that is by using slash click, which no longer works. So even those add-ons now are useless, and you need to basically do slash cancel aura in every macro for every buff that you want to remove. Now, that being said, if you go through this list, you can. So, two things. So, one, a lot of these buffs, I would say probably 70% of them, I haven't done the math, but I would say probably 70% or maybe 65% or somewhere in there, are things that you remove outside of combat. So what that means is like abolish disease. you don't want that on you, because when a priest casts, first of all, priests shouldn't be casting Abolish Disease, in my opinion, because there's really nothing. Priests can do Abolish Disease, and in the very first tick, it will remove a disease on you, but they can also just do Cure Disease, which doesn't put the buff on you. There's really no situation, at least in endgame rating. Now, maybe in 5-mans, but we're talking about endgame rating, which is where in 5-mans you're not in danger of being over the buff cap. But this is what I would consider to be an in-combat removal. Like, they're not going to be casting this while you're sitting there drinking and getting ready for a pull, right? Arcane Brilliance and Arcane Intellect, those usually are cast outside of combat. There's not mages are not going to be DPSing and then go, oh crap, Group 2 lost Arcane Brilliance, and then cast it. You know, that stuff is done before the pull outside of combat. So if we categorize the things we don't want to have on us as either in combat or out of combat, this list can become much smaller. And BCT can still remove buffs passively out of combat, and it tells you right here how to do it. So I think the default in here is 2 for the buffer. So I'm just going to read this. So it says this passive auto removal works only outside of combat when the amount of buffs you have plus the buffer, which is what this variable you're inputting here, exceeds 32. One buff at a time will be removed until the buffer is no longer breached. Set the buffer to 32 if you want to disallow blacklisted buffs constantly out of combat. So what that means is right now, basically, I have 0 buffs. I 0 buffs that you can see. I have 2 buffs that are invisible. One is Find Minerals, which you can see here. There's 2. And the other one is my stance. So I can get rid of Find Minerals pretty easily. And then if I... it's not updating. It should be updating to 1. But anyway, actually, let me just get in combat real quick. Oh, I just popped wreck on accident. Laugh out loud. See, now you'll see it slowly. So it's just... Okay, there. Now it's 1 out of 32. So if I put minerals back up, it should update. I don't recall what the update trigger is for BCT. But what this means, so right now, essentially I have no buffs. So if this is at 2, what that's saying is the number of buffs you have plus the buffer, once that exceeds 32, it'll start stripping buffs passively. So if you have this set to 2, you basically need to have 30 buffs, which is very difficult to do outside of combat in a raid. You'll probably be at 15 or 20, but it's never going to passively strip buffs out of combat if you don't update this buffer. So you have to come in here and update this. And it says if you want to constantly remove your blacklist, then set it to 32, which is what I do. Now, once it's at 32, and you have to do this for every profile. So if you have multiple profiles, yeah, and I've already done that, but let's go to default. See, now it's at 2. Now if I go to warrior, which I don't use this profile, it's at 2. You have to go to, and you have to enable it. You see that enable was unchecked. So you have to go to every profile that you use. So I use least restrictive, 32 enabled, and then I use most restrictive, 32 enabled, and then I use no restrictions, 32 enabled. Okay? So then anything that's in your blacklist for that profile, if it is put up on you while you are out of combat, it only works out of combat, again, it will automatically strip it off. So let me show you an example. So what profile are we on now? We're on no restrictions. So this list is a lot smaller because on no restrictions. So that's the other thing. I use 3 separate profiles, but now that this change has happened, because the reason I have 3 separate profiles is that you don't want to strip off things like renew and regrowth and rejuve and whatever when you're in a 5-man or 20-man raid or whatever. So what I would do is like the least restrictive and most restrictive, these were kind of my rating profiles, and then no restrictions was my 5-man, 10-man, 20-man, whatever. And the reason why is because you can see my list is a lot smaller here, but you still want to strip like Arcane Brilliance, Arcane Intellect, Blessing of Protection. These were all things that you wanted to strip even if you're on a 5-man. Like there's no reason to have Detect Invisibility. I mean, maybe in a couple 5-mans like Dire Maul, you could use that. But like Divine Spirit doesn't really do anything for you. Blessing of Wisdom doesn't do anything for you. Sanctuary, these are things that you just want to strip off all the time, no matter what. So I'm going to swap back to this most restrictive. Okay. So now what I'm going to end up doing, I haven't done it yet, is now that I'm going to be using BCT for passive out of combat buff stripping only, I can basically get down to just using one profile. And I have gone through this a little bit and removed some stuff, but like I said, there's something like Bloodthirst, it's never going to remove Bloodthirst because you're always in combat when that buff is up on you. So I might as well remove that from the list. I haven't touched this list yet because I was hopeful that the author or the contributor that is a friend of mine would be able to figure out a way to get this working again. So you can see here I don't have... There's a lot of other buffs on here. I'm gonna put Enrage on there. Let's see, where is Enrage? Berserker Rage. Yeah. So we're gonna say Blacklist. Okay. So now when I go to Blacklist, Berserker Rage is on my Blacklist. So I'm gonna show you that this will passively remove it. So I'm not in combat, right? Okay, there, Berserker Rage, and then immediately it took it off. Now, we're going to wait for the cooldown. Let's also do Battle Shout. Let's do all Battle Shout Blacklist. So what I'm going to do is put myself in combat first using Blood Rage. Then I'm going to Berserker Rage, and then I'm going to Battle Shout. And you'll see that those buffs stay up on me because I'm in combat. Okay, so you can see up here, I've got the buffs. I'm in combat. Wait for Blood Rage to drop, and then bam. As soon as I left combat, it killed him. So BCT is still useful. So now, before I forget, I'm going to remove these. Okay, take them off my blacklist. So what you need to do, and what that does. Let me go back to my macros, which I know that these are hard to see because they're at the edge of my screen. So for Bloodthirst, I have put in Blessing of Salvation, Greater Blessing of Salvation, Blessing of Protection, Find Minerals, Blood Rage, and Bloodthirst. And then for Revenge, which my Revenge is also my Heroic Strike, I have Abolish Disease, Blessing of the Claw, Fire Shield, Holy Power, Regrowth, and then I actually do have Renew in here, so I took it out because I was in a 5-man, and somebody was complaining that I was dropping Renew. So now I can basically strip all of the in-combat stuff that I don't want in just 2 macros. So I don't have Arcane Intellect in here, I don't have Divine Spirit, I don't have any of that stuff because that can all be stripped outside of combat. Like, it's extremely unlikely, like I said, that those are going to be buffed inside of combat. So there's no reason to have them put into a macro. What you do want to do, though, is to have things taken off, like Salvation. Sometimes Salvation gets put on right before the pool, and sometimes it gets put on, while you're running in, and maybe you got in combat, but then the Paladin didn't, or whatever. And then they're rebuffing while you just pulled the boss. You want to make sure and in case something happened, like you want to make sure salvation is off all the time. I'm probably also going to put this into my revenge macro because you can see I've still got 40 characters. Well, you probably can't see because it's smushed. I still have 40 characters I can use for revenge. So I can fit basically all the stuff that I want to strip in 2 macros, and then everything else can just, so like abolish disease, I can go ahead and just leave. You can leave it in there, it doesn't hurt. Armor of Faith, I'm probably gonna unblacklist that. Blessing of the Claw, I'm already stripping off, but I'll leave it in here anyway. Bloodthirst, it doesn't hurt to leave them in here because if they still remain after combat and you're not pressing your buttons anymore, it'll just strip them off. So it doesn't hurt anything to do that. Find minerals, I'll probably take that off blacklist because it's in my macro. Yeah, so and then again, you're gonna have to go through all your profiles. So that's probably why I'm gonna consolidate down to just one profile. So if you use BCT and you've discovered, like most of us have, that the in combat and most people I think weren't even using BCT passively like this because they didn't realize that by default it's at 2. And outside of combat, like I said, you're almost never going to hit the buff cap outside of combat. I don't even know if it's possible, unless you're purposely, using Enrage, Blood Rage, Shield Block, trinkets, all this other stuff. A lot of people probably don't even realize that that BCT does this out of combat. It's still very handy. So I would say yes, BCT is still useful. I still am going to use it. And I'm going to use it to strip off the things that are what I consider to be non-combat buffs or auras. And then in combat, I'm just going to use macros to take off the things that I don't want. So hopefully this is helpful to some folks. I know that there's some tanks out there that were frustrated that they had to dust off their old macros and spread all of these auras across 4 different buttons. But if you use BCT like this, it can help you quite a bit to reduce the amount of cancel aura macros that you need on your bars. So, all right, guys. Hopefully that's helpful. If there's any questions or if anyone has any comments, let me know, and I'll see you guys in the next video.